The date is August 19th, 2021. This is another lesson from the Alak Ahmed channel, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon. And this is the Alak Study Notes Torah commentary, the commentary of the Lord God. This is a new perspective lesson titled Moses' 400-year Exodus destroyed. The information in this lesson is not from God. We have long been taught that the Exodus from Egypt happened in Moses' time, and there will be another Exodus happening. I have taught that there is only one great Exodus from Egypt, and it did not happen in the time of Moses, about 3,500 years ago, but that the captivity and the Exodus will be in modern times. And as many teach, the 400 years of captivity, we've already been through that. If you're counting from 1619, as far as I see it doesn't matter when you start counting from, because whether you choose 1500 years or in the 1500s or 1600s, 400 years we've come past that. But it's famous to go by 1619. So clearly we have reached the 400 years. Whether the calculations can be done properly or not, we have served enough. 400 years is a time of completion of suffering and captivity, and we can all tell within our spirits that our time here in captivity is complete. Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2 reads, "And Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." This, I have pointed out in the past, is a bit strange, because the Pharaoh, being a Hamite, one of the descendants of Noah, the Pharaoh being a Hamite, one of the descendants of Noah, would have known Yahweh. He would have known of Yahweh. To say that he is not intimate with Yahweh, and that's what he meant, meaning he doesn't worship Yahweh, is not enough, because he knew of Yahweh in some way. Because remember, the Egyptians, they were very knowledgeable about many gods and had many gods themselves, although the understanding of the gods is a little bit different than what we have been taught. That's what I'm understanding now. It seems they used the gods to access certain parts of nature and existence and so on. So not necessarily worshiping each god the way we would worship God today or worship Jesus today or something like that. And it is said also that the Egyptians claimed to have figured out how the whole world works. So they would have certainly known the Creator. They would have certainly known Yahweh. And the Pharaoh would certainly have known the God of his father Noah. So, as a Hamite, the Pharaoh should have said something like, I know of Yahweh, my great-great-grandfather Noah used to worship him. Yahweh was a household god of ours, but we no longer worship him. But to just say he does not recognize Yahweh, which recognizes a part of the understanding of the word know, Yada, H3045, to say he has no knowledge of Yahweh is odd. It does not fit. So the Pharaoh is responding to Moses as if he knows nothing about the worship system of the people that Moses is trying to take out of Egypt. So the Pharaoh then in the text is made to lie. And this again for me shows that this is talking about a modern day 400-year slavery and not the one in the time of Moses or after Joseph died. It seems to be speaking of a modern thing. It's a prophecy of a modern slavery or captivity. Because we see that's what's happening today in modern times, where the Commonwealth nations have conspired together, like in Psalms 83, to do this slavery and captivity to us. And they have lied to us in many ways, like the Pharaoh would be lying right here, saying he doesn't have any idea about who this Yahweh is. In other words, he doesn't know of your worship system, who you worship, who you call Yahweh, and your people call Yahweh. I don't know this God. I know not the Lord. It's the same way these Commonwealth people, if you ask them, who were we worshiping before, or who were Africans worshiping before, and so on, they'll give you a runaround and some fake answers and so on. But what is clear is that today they go real far from telling us just what we were doing when they first captured us. In the different lands they found us and so on. And in Africa, you have to do your own searching to figure that out. So it's kind of like they're saying, we don't know your gods, just like the Pharaoh is saying, I know not the Lord. And now you can search up what were Africans doing in terms of, spiritually, before the Europeans came and fought and enslaved us and so on. What were we worshiping in the islands and so on, in the Caribbean and so on, different places they found us. They're saying to us, they don't know the Lord or they don't know our God. Which is why they are silent about that and they only give us this new God, Jesus. And then, they try to hide it from us. So this seems like a modern day storytelling right here and not something that happened in Moses' time, because the Pharaoh would have known. Now, if there rose up another Pharaoh that knew not Joseph, they would have briefed him on the people of Joseph. They would have briefed him on the people of Jacob right there in the land. Who are these powerful people, these well-to-do people and so on? He would have gotten a rundown. He would have known of their God because he would have looked at how they are blessed, how they're doing well, because remember they had the blessings that flowed through Joseph and so on. He would have had intimate knowledge of the people of Joseph there in Egypt. So he would have, by the time Moses showed up, known just who Yahweh really was and what Yahweh was about. So the Pharaoh was lying the same way they lie to us today about spiritual matters. The Pharaoh lied about spiritual matters when Moses was talking to him. This is a story dealing with our present day captivity. And again, this lesson is titled Moses' 400-year Exodus Destroyed in the Yalak Study Notes Torah Commentary on Twitter, YouTube, Patreon. Instead of dealing with the calculations of 400 years or 430 years or 200 and something years and all that, we will come from an angle that is clearly shown in the scriptures that we don't normally think of to show that the story is not about what happened in the time of Moses. Now we know Deuteronomy 28 talks about the captivity that Israel would go into. You will go into Egypt again by ships. By the way, I told you will not go again. So let's read that. Deuteronomy 28 verse 68. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there shall ye be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. And of course, it's been said they didn't go into that first Egypt with ships. Joseph went there on foot. They captured him and sold him as a slave down there and so on. So the ships, they say, is modern time. This 400-year prophecy in Deuteronomy chapter 28 describes a captivity that begins after Israel was serving the Most High as a nation in their own land with kings, priests, and prophets and scribes. Hello. Did you just understand that? The Deuteronomy 28 prophecy, especially when you consider what is taught about it and all the telling throughout the whole Torah, you understand that this major captivity is something that would take place after Israel was in their own land and the tribes were split up and they had their own kings and priests and so on. They had a full system and economy going. But this so-called captivity in the time of Moses, after Joseph died, and this Pharaoh rose up who knew not Joseph, that particular so-called captivity did not happen after they had the priests and kings and so on. They simply were just in the land and they were born and grew up there. And then a king showed up who knew not Joseph. So if it's after they had kings and prophets and so on, this means that it would be a modern captivity, not something that happened back there surrounding Joseph and Moses. Not something that happened back there surrounding Joseph and Moses. And what we normally see in the scriptures of the captivities, because remember they were in captivity after captivity, like in the book of Judges and other times, is usually that Israel was going into captivity after they had some kind of a structure set up of a nation. The nation was already structured in some kind of way. They had judges or they had kings and so on, right? The scribes, Pharisees, things like that. Prophets and so on, or teachers. But in Egypt, in the so-called first time when Moses took them out, they weren't structured like that, fully like that. They certainly did not have kings. For this great captivity, look at Ezekiel 39 verse 23. And the heathen shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they trespassed against me. Therefore hid I my face from them, and gave them into the hand of their enemies. So fell they all by the sword. Verses like this one are used to talk about the end time captivity the way it's taught by many teachers in this 400-year captivity and so on. It's saying that the people transgressed against the Most High. And that they did it because Israel as a nation would not follow the Most High. But they had stuff set up and they just transgressed. But like I'm saying, they weren't set up fully as a nation in the time of Joseph and Moses and so on, in terms of the full structure that these captivity scriptures are talking about all throughout the, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah and so on, Daniel and so on. They weren't properly structured yet. But the captivity scriptures are speaking of a people going into this long 400-year captivity after having been structured fully, had a full-blown system and kingdom up and running, and then they transgressed and were kicked out of the land into this long captivity. This cannot be applied to the time of that first Egypt after Joseph died and this new Pharaoh took over. So it's a modern captivity that the Moses story is talking about. It's just a story in prophecy mode, like I've said before, that we are supposed to understand and move past the erroneous teachings. And it's commonly taught that Israel really became a nation after they left Egypt, after that Exodus. You see, because that's when the structuring began, when they went into the wilderness and they started setting up a tent as a meeting place or a house of the Lord and so on. They started to structure themselves. And if you look here in Exodus 3:12, when the Most High was meeting with Moses with the burning bush and so on, in verse 12 it says, "And he said, Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain." So the nation now is getting some kind of an official direction towards worshiping God, to say, after this is all done, you're going to serve me upon this mountain. So the nation is being called or singled out by God to come and serve him on this mountain after they have been brought out. But you don't get this idea, this sense and this direction prior to Joseph going into the land and then growing up. And it's with the nation being set up and structured that they were being given commandments. Thou shalt not have other gods before me, stuff like that. Keep the Sabbath and all the other commandments. That stuff wasn't rolled out until Sinai, right? With all these many different commandments. Don't worship other gods. And can you imagine if this would have applied to Joseph? Because, it might sound strange, even offensive. But if you look at Joseph in a Christian kind of way, because remember he married women of the priest of On. So in a Christian kind of way, that's another god now. He's in this cult or this Egyptian priesthood. So in a Christian kind of way, he would have been a sinner because he's worshiping other gods. Or in a Torah kind of Old Testament kind of way, you would say he is an idol worshiper because he is in a cult Egyptian priesthood that had a focus on another God with a different teaching than the teaching of Israel. The priesthood of On, and marrying other women who were not Israelites, and their fathers in some strange priesthood that has nothing to do with the God of Israel, if you're just going to go by what the text is saying throughout the Torah. So this stuff that structures them was not yet in Joseph's time. So what would they have been transgressing? The transgression that leads to a 400-year captivity, as talked about in Deuteronomy 28 and also in Leviticus 26, is talking about a people who transgressed very detailed Torah commandments with a full structured priest system, king system, and scribes and so on, like I said, and many prophets. They transgressed and the system was broken up and smashed in order to destroy their kingdom and then send them off into a long 400-year captivity. This cannot be applied to the time of Joseph or right after he died and this new king took over. So the prophecy in Moses' time about Exodus, or the story, is just a prophecy. It did not actually happen. It applies to our time, this 400-year prophecy. There is only one Exodus from Egypt with a magnificent display of power from the Most High. We are the people who will see that happen. So they should go in Egypt again with ships just to go into captivity. Note that they're going into Egypt in ships just to go into captivity. But in Joseph or Moses' time, they were in Egypt not just to go into captivity. It was Joseph alone who was gone there in captivity, not a whole group of people, because they caught him when his brothers threw him in the pit, and he was sold and he went to prison and so on and was treated as a slave and his life ended up changing later on, we know that. But it's not a whole nation of people who went there, because the nation of people was described as even being split up and destroyed, and their whole system gone down. Joseph didn't have no whole system to go down in his one-person captivity when the Midianites took him. So in Moses' time, the people ended up being in Egypt and then were oppressed, not because they went there specifically for captivity as a nation. They simply grew out of Jacob or grew out of Joseph and continued to grow, and were led or managed by Joseph. So they grew into a large people by living there. They were not specifically a large group of people in Egypt just because they were taken there on ships. So this does not fit the story of the people of the Most High being in Egypt that first time, who later in the story came out of Egypt, because they did not go in, their presence in Egypt was not due to being there by slave ships, but by just simply having children and growing until they grew into a large number, because they were growing out of Joseph. Basically growing out of Jacob. Now, the 400-year captivity prophecy describes a people who went into captivity after first being in their own land. But in the time of Joseph/Moses, their oppression did not begin by them being in their own land first, that they were given by the Most High. They were moved to Goshen, we know, but that was not something given by some miracle from the Most High through wars and so on. We know that the people of the 400-year captivity were given land first by the Most High before being sent into a 400 captivity, which would be our time. But they were first given land by the Most High after defeating the Canaanites. And then later on, after a long time of going through many kings and so on, then their captivity came. And they went into 400 years in our time. So, the story gets kind of messy because we know there was the Assyrian and Babylonian captivity and so on. So the whole thing is messy, but that's why I approach it as a story set in prophecy mode. Because they didn't just start 400-year prophecy just like that. It would take a long time. So it was a story talking about a modern time, a time far away from Joseph and Moses' time. Because in order to teach the 400-year captivity, slave ship stuff, the teachers usually have to go back and read all this stuff and saying they were in Egypt and led out by Moses first, and then come through Red Sea and so on, and then they set up their kingdom and had kings and whatever, prophets and whatever, and then that all went down because of transgressions, and then slave ship captivity begins another 400-year captivity. So the way they teach it is to say that they were first in their own land. They first came out of Egypt and then had their own land with a full kingdom set up, and the tribes split up in their own individual lands, and then captivity came later on. But in the time of this Joseph, they were there protected in Goshen, and then eventually Moses came and so on. But they were not transgressing in that land of Goshen. They were actually righteous people. And the Pharaoh just got scared because they were growing so well, because their God was good to them and so on. They were growing so strong, and he wanted to attack them and try to kill the male babies and so on. He was trying to do them harm, to break them down and destroy them and so on. But so they ended up into that time of oppression with the new king that rose up, not because of their transgressions, but they were actually a righteous people in Goshen. So you see, the time of oppression in the time of Joseph/Moses was a time of oppression that came out of just simply hatred, not oppression that came out of them sinning. That would happen later on, after the kingdom was set up and the people kept transgressing, breaking commandments and so on. And then later on, they got kicked out of the land, and here we are, 400-year captivity. So you see the difference? That supposed first captivity of supposed 400 years in Joseph/Moses' time did not come out of rebellion against God's commandments. It was just born out of hatred from the Pharaoh. He saw these great people, they were growing large in numbers. He wanted to cut down their numbers and so on and keep them oppressed. So the Deuteronomy 28 captivity is describing a people who got into captivity because of manifold transgressions against Torah. This does not apply to that first oppression in Egypt, because that was not their problem. They weren't sinning left, right, and center to deserve this. The 400-year captivity is taught as the scripture shows that prophets were sent to repeatedly warn Israel to turn back. That didn't happen in Joseph/Moses' time. They were just simply hated. Let's carry on some more. Let's give another verse here that gives an example of what I'm saying with the transgressions and the full setup of the kingdom and so on of Israel before some kind of transgression or punishment happens. That was not just simply hatred from another king, but a response from God for their transgressions and bad living. Ezra 9 verse 7, since the days of our fathers have we been in a great trespass unto this day. And our iniquities have we, our kings and our priests, been delivered into the hand of the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, and to a spoil, and to confusion of face, as it is this day. So here it is, this verse is letting you know that to get the confusion of face, and even that term is used in Deuteronomy 28, and the captivity and so on, to go into some kind of captivity, it is because, as they're mentioning here, of the great trespass that they did since the days of their fathers. Well, you normally say their fathers are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, in the time of Joseph, or when Joseph died, and they had this great oppression in Egypt, they weren't doing these things, because they would have said since the time of Joseph. In other words, they were saying since the time of our fathers, which you normally say is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Since that time we haven't done these transgressions to get this kind of captivity that they're discussing here, which means it does not apply to the time of Joseph dying and a new king rose up that knew not Joseph. So they're saying to you pretty much that the Joseph/Moses oppression did not happen because of captivity, because since the time from before Joseph was born, but rather the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this level of transgression and so on for our iniquities, dealing with our priests, kings, and so on, never happened. Never happened all the time. It's now that it's happening, they're saying. So, to reach into some kind of captivity from transgression, which would more fit Deuteronomy 28 style captivity, they would have had to have kings, priests, prophets, and so on who transgressed. But they never had kings and so on until after the Red Sea splitting. But they never had kings and so on until after the Red Sea splitting. So the 400-year captivity would have to include transgressions of kings and prophets and so on, lying prophets, deceiving prophets, and so on, and lying scribes who wrote the wrong stuff. Like Jeremiah 8 verse 8, the lying scribes, with the pen of the scribe is in vain. So these are the things that are going into captivity for. This does not apply to the time of Joseph/Moses. But rather they got kings and so on after the Red Sea. Because remember now, Saul became the first king. And then the king started sinning in transgression, right? And the prophets would start to pop up, and Aaron, the priesthood of Aaron and so on, all these things did not exist. Remember, Joseph was associated with a priesthood system of Egypt. So how's the Most High going to punish them for a priesthood system of On when he never gave them Torah commandments to follow the laws of the priesthood system of On and the religion of On? They're not breaking God's commandments by breaking priesthood of On stuff. If anything, they just shouldn't have been in On, period. Joseph shouldn't have been doing that. Isaiah 28 verse 7. But they also have erred through wine and through strong drink are out of the way. The priest and the prophet have erred through strong drink. See that the priest and the prophet. So these are the reasons why they are going into captivity for 400 years eventually. They didn't have priest and prophet in the time of Joseph/Moses, meaning a full priest and prophet system and so on, right? They are swallowed up of wine. They are out of the way through strong drink. They err in vision. They stumble in judgment. This is something that happened later on, after the Exodus from Egypt. So it does not apply to the time of Moses/Joseph. Jeremiah 1 verse 18. For behold, I have made thee this day a defenced city and an iron pillar and brazen walls against the whole land. See that now? Because I said the land, the kingdom was structured and set up fully. So here's another verse trying to deal with that. Against the whole land, against the kings of Judah. So this is not about no 400 years is not about no first captivity with Joseph and Moses' time. This is a future thing that the Moses Exodus was talking about. Future of the Bible times. It's our time. Against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, against the princes thereof, against the priests thereof, and against the people of the land. It's after they got their full stuff set up, the full kingdom running and so on of Israel, that a 400-year captivity would take place, not before they were fully set up after the Red Sea splitting and Exodus and so on. Not before that, which would mean that they were serving it in Joseph/Moses time. No, the Joseph/Moses prophecy and so on is just a story set in prophecy mode, as I have said in other lessons on this matter. Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 9. And it shall come to pass at that day, saith the Lord, that the heart of the king shall perish, and the heart of the princes and the priests shall be astonished, and the prophets shall wonder. So judgment is coming upon this people that has a full kingdom, a full system set up. So it would apply to something, a punishment that would lead to a 400-year kind of stuff. They did not have priests and kings and so on of Israel in the time of Joseph. Now let's mention quickly the priesthood. The priesthood of the nation of Israel was set up in the wilderness after leaving Egypt. After leaving Egypt. So priests were not taken into captivity that was living in a kingdom of Israel in that supposed first captivity in Egypt in Moses' time. Priests who transgressed were not taken into that captivity. But in the 400-year captivity, there would be much talk about priests along with other power people like the prophets and so on. They were being punished in the 400-year captivity by having their whole system be dismantled and their kingdom destroyed. This cannot apply to the first so-called captivity in the time of Joseph/Moses. The Levitical priesthood also, it started, that would be punished with being threatened with a 400-year captivity. That Levitical priesthood started later after that Moses/Joseph Exodus. It would be started with Aaron. It was linked to Aaron because we know the priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, would be linked to Aaron. And even if you want to say there was Melchizedek as a priest before or whatever, Melchizedek has nothing to do with 400-year captivity. Melchizedek was not a priest of Israel. He was a priest of the Most High God, not a priest of the nation of Israel. He had no place in Israel and he was not an Israelite. Israelite structure was set up after the time of Joseph/Moses. So all these things don't apply to that time that we usually think of as the first captivity in Exodus in Egypt. No, the first one is this one, meaning this first major Egypt captivity in the scriptures and major Exodus is of one and only one. That's a super powerful deliverance and Exodus from Egypt. It's in modern times. Exodus 40 and verse 15, and thou shalt anoint them as thou didst anoint their father, that they may minister unto me in the priest's office, for their anointing shall surely be an everlasting priesthood throughout their generations. So the priesthood is being set up here after leaving Egypt. Remember, this is still the book of Exodus. And it's these priests who would later keep transgressing repeatedly, along with prophets transgressing by telling lies and so on, and kings going astray and so on. It's these people who would be threatened with a Deuteronomy 28 style Egypt captivity. The people in Joseph's time who were in Goshen were not threatened and warned repeatedly about a captivity for massive sinning. They were simply hated and targeted by the Pharaoh. That was just something born out of hate, not for repeated transgressions and refusing to keep the Sabbath and so on. The Egypt captivity prophecy then, from Deuteronomy 28, dealing with the 400 years, that is normally taught, says that the nation of Israel with priests and kings and so on would go into Egypt as a nation that has a broken Yahweh worship system. Prior to Moses, this did not happen, as the priesthood started after the Exodus in the wilderness linked to Aaron, the line of Aaron, and the nation began to grow and take on form after that Exodus in the wilderness, with even Saul, as I mentioned earlier, becoming the first king that would lead to kings being threatened with an Egypt-style captivity, linking to Deuteronomy 28. All this could not have happened after Joseph died and before Moses was born. Hello. Jeremiah 23 verse 11. For both prophet and priest are profane. Yea, in my house have I found their wickedness, saith the Lord. So again, verses like this one are the kind of verses that tell why the 400-year captivity was threatened and thrust upon Israel. Both prophet and priest, they were wicked. This kind of threat was not made to to the children of Israel in the time of Joseph/Moses. They did not have prophets and priests who were profane and wicked at that time. Their people were simply targeted because of their great numbers and how they were being blessed and so on by the Most High. For good work ethic and trusting in the Most High, things like that. And the blessing of the Most High was upon them. And they were being grown in Egypt. They were simply targeted for those things, not because of their wickedness in the house of the Lord. For it says, yea, in my house have I found their wickedness. So this is something for future captivity, not the so-called captivity or oppression of Joseph/Moses' time. The 400-year captivity happened in modern times. Many say 1619, some say 1500s, whatever it is. And we just completed that 400 years if we're going by one of those dates or by the 1619. And now the world is going berserk with weather madness, floods and so on, right? Great storms and threats of bigger wars going on, end-time lockdowns, and the teasing of deadly viruses that will one day wipe out many of the wicked in an Isaiah 24 style, that will eventually bring on the deliverance of the children of the Most High. The 400-year Moses captivity teaching, as we have always known it, to be a second Egypt captivity that has a magnificent display of power and so on, is a worldwide deception. This would more be in line with a better view of the matter. The 400-year captivity, long-standing teaching, is a deception. It's not from old times, and then this is the second one. This is the only Egypt captivity that will bring about the magnificent display of power and deliverance from the Most High. This is the only Egypt captivity that fits the Deuteronomy 28 description. Twitter, YouTube, Patreon, Yalak Emmett channel. This is the Yalak Study Notes Torah commentary, the commentary of the Lord God.